Our marriage wasn't always like this. I remember when Rachel's laughter would echo through the house, filling it with warmth. But those memories felt like faded photographs, reminders of what had slipped through our fingers. Lately, our home was nothing more than a silent battleground. It started subtly. Missed dinners, averted gazes, smiles that never reached her eyes. At first, I attributed her distant behavior to work stress. Rachel had been taking on extra projects, claiming she wanted to secure a promotion. But as days turned into weeks, it was clear there was more to her late nights and locked phone than just office work. Suspicion clawed at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it aside. I told myself I was imagining things, letting insecurity gnaw at my peace. Yet, the nagging feeling persisted. Every time her phone buzzed and she'd glance at it, swiftly tucking it away, my chest tightened. I noticed changes that would be insignificant to most. The new perfume she wore, the way she'd laugh more freely during calls I wasn't privy to. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid until one evening, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. It was late. Rachel was still at the office, or so she said. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen when I spotted a stack of mail on the counter. Shuffling through the bills and flyers, a glossy slip caught my eye, a receipt from an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind we hadn't visited in years. My eyes darted to the signature at the bottom. Andrew. My throat tightened. Andrew was her colleague, the one she always mentioned in passing, his name woven into casual stories with an ease that now felt calculated. I stood there, the receipt trembling in my hand. The logical part of me screamed for restraint, to put it back and pretend I hadn't seen it. But the raw ache in my gut made it impossible. I didn't need to be a detective to know what that receipt implied. Rachel had been distant for months, but now I had proof, or at least, the start of it. When she came home that night, she was still wearing that familiar smile. "Sorry I'm late," she said, planting a distracted kiss on my cheek before heading upstairs. I watched her retreat, feeling more a stranger in my own home than ever before. The warmth of her touch, once reassuring, now sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to engage her, throwing out questions about her day, subtle probes masked as casual conversation. But she answered without meeting my eyes, her responses short, practiced. I told myself I needed more than a receipt before I confronted her. There was too much at stake: our years together, the life we'd built, even the friendships woven into our marriage. But the cracks were there, undeniable and widening with every passing day. I resolved to watch more closely, to pick up on the small things that might confirm what I dreaded most. That week, my observations turned into an obsession. I noted how Rachel's phone never left her side, how she'd smile at her screen with a softness that used to be reserved for me. She'd go out for drinks with coworkers, coming back smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne. Each time, the distance between us grew, unspoken but felt in every glance and silence. The final push came one Friday evening. I was clearing up the dining room, our conversation over dinner already forgotten. Rachel's phone, buzzing with a notification, slid from the table and landed face up. For a fleeting moment, I caught the preview of a message: "Looking forward to tomorrow night. Andrew." My heart pounded as she snatched the phone up, her eyes darting to mine before she turned away. "Just work stuff," she muttered, but her voice wavered. It was a small betrayal of composure, but it spoke louder than any lie. The trust we once had, the certainty that our love was enough, it was all crumbling. I knew then that I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. My world was already changing, and the facade of our life together was breaking apart, piece by piece. In the days following that fateful Friday, a quiet, gnawing resolve settled over me. I became the silent observer, blending into the background of our household, unnoticed yet keenly aware of everything Rachel did. Each glance, every casual word, felt magnified, and I hung on to the smallest of details as though they were clues in an unsolvable puzzle. The mornings were routine on the surface. Rachel left early, a thermos of coffee in hand, and offered a distracted goodbye. But I noticed how she seemed to linger by the mirror a little longer, carefully applying makeup that was more deliberate than usual. The new attention to detail: lipstick brighter, eyeshadow more daring, didn't go unnoticed. I bit back my questions, choosing instead to nod as she left, my smile tight. At work, I went through the motions. My colleagues would ask about my weekend, and I'd mutter the usual pleasantries, forcing a chuckle or two. But inside, my mind raced, replaying every fragmented conversation Rachel and I had, analyzing her words for hidden meanings. My productivity plummeted, yet I couldn't care less. My evenings were the real work, the watching, the waiting. One evening, I timed my walk to the market, hoping to pass by her office just as she finished. Under the cloak of twilight, I stood across the street, half hidden by the shadow of a closed bookstore. It was then that I saw them, Rachel and Andrew, exiting the building together. They didn't touch, not overtly, but there was something in the way she laughed, leaning a little too close, that sparked a fire in my chest. I clutched the grocery bag tighter, the plastic creaking under my grip. They parted ways at the curb, and Rachel's smile lingered even as she walked alone to her car. The image haunted me as I returned home, my mind torn between disbelief and fury. When she arrived later, cheerful and flushed, she kissed me with the same detached affection, and I swallowed my questions. Her act was flawless, honed through months of whatever game she was playing. Determined to dig deeper, I started checking her phone. It wasn't easy. She had always been careful. But one night, after she fell asleep, I inched over to her side of the bed, my heart thumping so hard it threatened to wake her. The screen's glow lit up my face as I entered her passcode, a combination I'd guessed after years of familiarity. Her messages were clean, but her call logs told another story. Frequent calls to Andrew, some brief, others long enough to suggest more than professional courtesy. Each one felt like a stab, but I recorded the times, committing them to memory. The phone clicked off, and I slipped it back, retreating into the cocoon of my side of the bed, the silence louder than any argument. Days passed with more subtle investigations. I'd glance over the bank statements, noting transactions at cafes and shops we never frequented together. A charge at a hotel bar downtown nearly made me confront her then and there, but I stopped myself, clenching my fists until the urge passed. I needed proof, undeniable and cold. It was no longer enough to suspect. I needed to know. During this time, Kate, Rachel's best friend, seemed to visit more often. Her laughter would ring out in the living room as they shared wine, oblivious to my presence down the hall. I began to notice how Kate's gaze lingered on me when she thought I wasn't looking. It was curious, this newfound attention. While Rachel pulled away, Kate's interest seemed to grow. It was an irony not lost on me, but I kept it filed away. Another piece of the unfolding drama. Late one night, I installed a small recording device in Rachel's car, hidden under the seat. It felt wrong, like stepping into a version of myself I didn't recognize, but it was necessary. The next day, I waited impatiently for her to leave. When she did, I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me, 1,000 memories flooding in, mingled with resentment. By the time she returned that evening, I had already replayed the recording twice. The snippets of her phone call echoed in my ears. "I can't tonight." "Yes, tomorrow. I'll find a way." Her voice, so tender, so familiar yet foreign. It left me hollowed out. The days blurred together after that. I was exhausted, caught between wanting to confront her and holding out for the perfect moment. Rachel's behavior grew increasingly comfortable, almost daring. She left traces of perfume on her collar that wasn't hers and came home with an unfamiliar glow. And yet, in the mornings, she looked at me with eyes that once held love, now clouded with something I couldn't name. I had to push down the rage, keep my mask intact, while the silent observations continued, waiting for the moment that would shatter everything beyond repair. The night I decided to act felt like an inevitability. The past weeks of silent observing had turned into a ritual I dreaded but couldn't stop. I knew Rachel's lies were eating away at whatever remained of our marriage, but confronting her with just anger and accusations wouldn't be enough. I needed to tip the scales, not just expose the cracks. Enter Kate. If there was anyone who could turn the tables, it was her. Rachel's confidant and the one person who knew our marriage almost as intimately as we did. And recently, her attention toward me had taken a shift, lingering glances, a touch that lasted a beat too long. At first, I dismissed it, But as Rachel's betrayals mounted, I began to see it differently. If Rachel was using her colleague as a crutch, why shouldn't I use her friend as my pivot? The setup began with subtlety. I reached out to Kate one evening, under the guise of seeking advice. She came over, her dark hair tied back, eyes bright with curiosity. "What's going on, John? You seem tense on the phone." I offered her a drink, making small talk until the tension was tangible. I opened up about Rachel's late nights, the growing distance. Kate listened, nodding sympathetically, sipping her wine as if tasting the drama itself. "She's been off, I know," Kate admitted softly, avoiding my gaze. "But maybe it's just stress?" "No," I said, sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened, and I softened my tone. "I've seen things, Kate. I just don't know how to handle it." There was a pause, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The silence stretched until she placed a hand on mine, a gesture that felt more electric than it should have. It was then I realized my plan was working. Our meetings became frequent. Kate would come by after Rachel's outings, always with a pretext returning a borrowed book, needing to talk. Each visit brought us closer, a shared complicity we never addressed but both understood. Rachel, wrapped in her own double life, never questioned Kate's presence. Perhaps she saw it as proof of my loneliness, unaware that it had evolved into something more. The culmination of weeks of subtle moves came during a quiet, rain-slicked Friday evening. Rachel was working late again. I knew she wasn't, not with the recordings I'd gathered. I invited Kate over, claiming I needed to talk urgently. She showed up in a coat that glistened with raindrops, her expression a mix of concern and something else, anticipation. I lit a fire in the living room, the flames crackling like a backdrop to a stage play. We talked about everything and nothing, the conversation winding in comfortable circles until I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. The room fell silent, save for the rain pattering against the windows, and we kissed a tentative step over the line that Rachel had already crossed. The affair with Kate was more than just revenge. It was a reclamation of control. For the first time in months, I felt alive, wanted. The guilt that nipped at the edges of my conscience was drowned out by the vindication burning in my chest. When Rachel came home that night, smelling of wine and someone else's cologne, she was none the wiser. Her eyes met mine briefly before she muttered an excuse about an unexpected meeting and went upstairs. I watched her go, my heart drumming not with anger, but with the satisfaction of knowing I wasn't a silent victim anymore. The setup extended to more than just clandestine moments with Kate. I needed a final act, a gathering that would lay everything bare, with no room for lies. A dinner party, I decided, would be the perfect stage. Inviting Rachel, Andrew, and Kate was risky, but that was the point. I sent out the invitations under the guise of a simple evening of friends catching up. Rachel agreed without question, still unaware that her secret life had a shadow. The day of the dinner arrived, charged with a tension that only I seemed to feel. I set the table with precision, candles flickering, their glow casting long shadows. Rachel wore a dress I hadn't seen in years, deep blue and elegant, as if trying to rekindle a spark she didn't know had already burned out. Kate arrived next, locking eyes with me briefly before settling into her role. When Andrew arrived, he offered Rachel a familiar grin that made my jaw tighten. We exchanged pleasantries over appetizers, each laugh and raised glass a countdown to what would come next. The room was filled with forced laughter, but my pulse thrummed with anticipation. As the main course was served, I stood, wine glass in hand, and took a breath. "To honesty," I said, eyes sweeping the table. Rachel's hand twitched, her smile faltering. Andrew glanced at her, puzzled, and Kate, sweet Kate, simply sipped her drink, eyes steady on mine. The setup was complete. Now, the truth would spill. The moment I raised my glass and uttered that simple toast, to honesty, the room shifted. The casual chatter halted as if someone had muted a radio. Rachel's smile, once confident, wavered, her eyes flitting to Andrew and back to me. The seconds ticked by, each one pressing down with the weight of unsaid words. "John, that's quite the toast," Kate said, breaking the silence with a smile that only I understood. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, ready for the show I had promised without words. Andrew shifted in his seat, his expression half curious, half concerned. He didn't know it yet, but he was seated at the center of his own unraveling. I took my time, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, savoring the tension like a string drawn taut. It is, I agreed, setting down my glass and leaning forward. Honesty is a rare thing these days, don't you think? My gaze landed squarely on Rachel, whose fingers twitched against the fabric of her dress. The flickering candlelight cast long, nervous shadows on her face. Rachel cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "What's this about, John?" The edge in her voice was unmistakable. I pulled out the receipts I had found, folding them carefully and placing them on the table. The crisp sound of paper hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the silence. Andrew's eyes darted between the papers and Rachel, confusion slowly morphing into realization. "I think you know exactly what this is about," I said, my voice low, controlled. Rachel's face paled. Her carefully constructed mask cracked, just for a moment, before she forced it back into place. "John, can we not do this here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "No, I think this is the perfect place," I countered. "After all, we're all friends here, aren't we?" My eyes moved to Andrew, who now sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Kate, ever the silent observer, sat back in her chair, crossing her legs and watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a theater. Andrew finally spoke, his voice tight. "Look, John, if this is about work." I cut him off, laughing humorlessly. "Is that what you call those late-night dinners and hotel bills?" My eyes bore into him, watching his realization set in fully, the blood draining from his face. Rachel looked between us, her breathing shallow, eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist. "John, please, not here," she said, louder now, her voice laced with desperation. "No, here," I insisted, my voice steady but icy. "We've lived too long with pretense. It ends tonight." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, placing it beside the receipts. Calls, Rachel. The messages, the timestamps. I have it all. The room felt electric, everyone on the verge of movement, but paralyzed by the tension. Rachel finally broke, her voice a whisper thick with fear. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." And there it was, the confession I'd waited weeks to hear. It was raw, unplanned, tumbling out before she could stop it. Andrew's jaw clenched, a mix of shame and regret pooling in his eyes. The sound of the clock ticking on the mantel was the only noise as Rachel's words hung in the air. "You didn't mean for what to go this far?" I pressed, my tone sharp. I wanted her to say it, to lay it out in front of Andrew and Kate, to strip away the last of her pretense. She looked down, fingers twisting in her lap. "Andrew and I," the words choked her, and she looked up, eyes glistening. "It was never supposed to mean anything." "Meaningless?" I echoed, my voice shaking for the first time. "You shattered us for nothing?" Andrew's head dropped, his hands covering his face. Kate, shifting beside me, placed a hand on my arm, a silent show of solidarity that Rachel noticed. Her eyes narrowed, a realization dawning, but she said nothing. "I see," Rachel said finally, her voice steadying, a coldness seeping into her gaze. "This wasn't just about me, was it?" She looked at Kate, then back at me, piecing together the hints she had ignored. The room fell silent again, but it was different this time, heavier. I stood up, unable to bear the suffocating tension any longer. "No, Rachel, it wasn't just about you. But you started this." I turned to leave, the weight of the night pressing down on me. Before I stepped away, I glanced back at Kate. She nodded, her expression unreadable. The confrontation was done, the room left in stunned silence. But the real consequences, I knew, were just beginning. The room sat in stunned silence long after I left it, echoes of my words hanging like an unwanted guest. The air felt thick, charged with the aftermath of exposed truths. I walked to the kitchen and leaned against the counter, feeling the pounding in my chest as if my heart had been replaced by a war drum. The muffled voices from the living room reached me, heated and frantic. Rachel's, high-pitched with desperation, Andrew's lower and strained, and Kate's steady and unbothered, as if detached from the chaos. I poured myself a drink, the clink of ice on glass the only familiar sound in a moment that felt utterly alien. A minute later, Kate appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. She stepped forward, placing a tentative hand on my arm. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "Are any of us?" I replied, the bitterness curling in my voice. I met her eyes and saw a reflection of my own turmoil. Before she could respond, the sound of Rachel's heels clicking against the hardwood floor grew louder. She stood in the hallway, eyes glistening, her makeup smudged in a way I hadn't seen before. Vulnerable, stripped of the careful mask she always wore. "John, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling but insistent. "Talk?" I echoed, taking a sip of the whiskey that burned my throat. "What's left to say, Rachel? We're past explanations." She flinched but held her ground. "No, we're not. You think you know everything, but you don't." Her eyes flickered to Kate, who stood quietly, observing but unmoving. "And you? Really? With her?" Kate's hand fell from my arm, and she straightened, meeting Rachel's stare without flinching. "You have no right to judge, Rachel," she said, her voice steady. "Not tonight." Rachel's composure broke then, a sob escaping her lips before she managed to choke it back. Andrew appeared behind her, his presence shadowy, as though he didn't quite belong in this tableau. He kept his distance, eyes darting between us like a spectator afraid to be called on stage. "You think this was just about being unfaithful?" Rachel's voice wavered. "You ignored me for years, John. You were always so distant, so obsessed with work, with your perfect image of what we were supposed to be." I set down my glass, the noise sharp. "And that's why you turned to him?" I pointed toward Andrew, who shifted uncomfortably, his eyes now locked on the floor. "Because I wasn't there enough for you? That's your justification?" "It wasn't about justification," she said, tears spilling over now. "It was about feeling seen, even if it was a mistake." Silence fell again, this one different, no longer sharp but suffocating. Kate stepped back, moving toward the living room, leaving us in the hallway with only the dim kitchen light between us. Andrew, finally breaking his silence, cleared his throat. "I should go," he muttered, looking for the exit like a drowning man would search for air. "No," Rachel said firmly, surprising even him. "You stay. You were part of this, too." She turned to me, her eyes raw. "But so was I. And so were you, John." A flash of anger coursed through me. "Don't turn this on me," I spat. "I didn't step outside our marriage. You did." Rachel's eyes softened, as if pitying me. "But did you? Or did you just wait until you had your excuse?" Her glance toward Kate, now watching from the living room, was pointed, like an accusation wrapped in silence. The implications cut deep. The line between victim and betrayer blurred, splintering under the weight of shared guilt. My grip on the counter tightened until my knuckles whitened. Memories of the past months flooded in late nights with Kate, the rush of adrenaline that came with reclaiming something Rachel had taken. The realization that I'd taken my own revenge, justified or not, tightened my chest. "John," Kate's voice, steady as ever, called from the living room. "This isn't helping." She stepped back into the hallway, her eyes on Rachel now. "None of this fixes what's broken. The question is, where do you all go from here?" Rachel wiped her eyes, drawing in a shuddering breath. "I don't know," she whispered. It was an admission that hung in the air, honest and painful. For the first time, we were all bare, masks stripped away. Andrew looked at her with an expression of guilt that mirrored my own. Kate, the silent observer now caught in the crossfire, folded her arms and glanced at me, a question in her eyes. I pushed away from the counter, turning to leave the room. "I guess we figure that out one step at a time," I muttered, the resolve in my voice thin but present. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it an ending, just a stark acceptance that from this point forward, nothing would be the same. The house had never felt so silent. After the confrontation, Andrew left without another word, and Kate made an excuse to go home, her eyes locking with mine in a silent question before she turned and slipped into the night. That left Rachel and me alone, standing on opposite ends of a room that once held laughter and quiet conversations about the future. Now, it was just a battlefield littered with shattered trust. Rachel's breathing was still uneven, her chest rising and falling like she'd just run a marathon. I couldn't tell if she was more relieved or terrified that the truth was out. I wasn't sure which one I felt either. The silence pressed on us, relentless. "I never wanted it to end up like this," she finally said, breaking the silence with a voice so small it barely reached me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without the bitterness rising up again. Instead, I walked to the window, staring out at the empty street illuminated by pools of yellow light from the lampposts. The world outside seemed indifferent to the chaos inside this house. I turned back to see Rachel staring at the floor, a tear glistening on her cheek. "Why him?" The question came out quieter than I intended, stripped of accusation, just raw curiosity. She met my eyes, and for the first time in a long while, there was no defiance or defense in her gaze. Just weariness. "It wasn't about him. Not really," she said, her voice quivering. "It was about feeling something, anything that reminded me I was still here. Still me." The honesty of it hit me like a punch. We had both been searching for that spark, only in different, destructive ways. Rachel's affair, my calculated revenge with Kate, two paths that led to the same ruined place. The realization stung with a truth I hadn't wanted to admit. Neither of us was blameless. "I can't undo what's happened," Rachel continued, taking a cautious step forward. "But we need to decide if this is where it all ends, or if we try to find a way back." I crossed my arms, the weight of the night pressing on my chest like a stone. Could we rebuild from this? The idea seemed absurd, yet the alternative felt just as impossible. Memories of years spent together, shared breakfasts, trips, the quiet nights on the couch flashed in my mind, taunting me with their simplicity. "Do you even want to try?" I asked, more for myself than for her. Rachel's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, fragile and uncertain. "I do," she said, voice breaking. "If you do." A tense silence followed, filled with the ticking of the clock that had overseen so many of our fights and reconciliations. The decision lay between us like a bridge half broken, waiting for one of us to test its strength. "I don't know," I said, my voice low, barely more than a breath. It was the truth, and it was all I could offer. "But I'm willing to talk." Rachel nodded, the smallest of movements, but in the suffocating silence of the room, it felt like a declaration. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us both vast and intimate. We talked through the night, voices low and hesitant, peeling back layers that had long been left to harden. There were tears, harsh words, apologies that felt too small, but were all we had. By morning, the first light slipping through the curtains, we were exhausted. The rawness of the night left us frayed but strangely lighter. We hadn't fixed anything. That would take time, if it was even possible. But we hadn't walked away either. The turning point wasn't forgiveness, it was the realization that we were both more than our worst choices. "I need space," I said finally, standing up and stretching, my body aching from tension and fatigue. "Time to think." Rachel's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I understand. Take what you need." There was a pause before she spoke again. "John, for whatever it's worth." "I am so sorry." I nodded, the words not ready to be accepted, but not wholly rejected either. "So am I." I left the house as dawn broke, the cool air biting against my skin, waking me fully for the first time in what felt like months. The street was quiet, the world unaware of the wars fought behind closed doors. I walked down the empty sidewalk, each step uncertain but moving forward, nonetheless. The road ahead was unclear, scattered with doubts and pain, but it was there, waiting to be defined. In that moment, I realized that rebuilding or walking away would be equally difficult. But at least now, we'd laid everything bare, exposed the truth in all its ugliness. And that, maybe, was where true rebuilding could begin, even if it meant we didn't rebuild together. The days after that raw, sleepless night were quiet and heavy, like the silence after a storm. Rachel and I moved around the house like ghosts, acknowledging each other with nods and brief, polite words. It was strange. A marriage paused, stripped down to its bare essentials. We no longer had to pretend. All the lies were out, yet what came next was unknown. I spent a lot of time driving aimlessly, the city blurring past my windows, trying to find a semblance of clarity in the rhythm of the road. Each turn felt like a choice, a small decision in a larger, undefined plan. Rachel had suggested counseling, and I agreed, but only with the understanding that it would be a place for both honesty and final decisions, wherever they might lead. The first session was raw. We sat across from a neutral stranger in a warmly lit office that smelled faintly of lavender and books. Rachel spoke first, her voice low and steady, recounting the chain of moments that led her astray. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling unseen, of mistakes she couldn't take back but desperately wished she could. I followed, revealing not just her betrayals but my own life spent more in work than in our marriage, a thirst for revenge that had ultimately soured in my mouth. When the counselor asked, "Why are you both here?" the answer hung in the air. Rachel looked at me, eyes searching for any flicker of hope. I felt the weight of her stare but kept mine fixed on the floor, tracing the pattern of the rug. To see if there's anything left worth saving, I finally said, the words stark and honest. Outside the sessions, I still saw Kate. Not in secret, not in heated moments of passion, but once or twice, sitting across a cafe table, talking like old friends whose bond had survived a storm. She was understanding, listening without judgment as I talked about the mess I was trying to sift through. Her support was gentle, free of expectation. It felt strange to have her as an anchor, considering how it all began, but it grounded me when everything else felt adrift. Meanwhile, Rachel and I navigated our days cautiously. We moved between tentative conversations about the future and silent evenings where the weight of the past crowded the room. One night, as we stood by the window, watching the rain blur the city lights, she turned to me. "I found an apartment," she said softly. "I think I need to move out just for a while." A part of me felt relief. Another part cracked open with grief. "Maybe it's for the best," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. It was not an end, not yet, but a necessary distance to see if the pieces could fit together again, or if it was time to stop trying. The day she moved out was overcast, the sky reflecting the muted mood in the house. Boxes lined the hallway, labeled in her neat handwriting. Rachel paused at the door, a small suitcase by her feet, and looked back. "I hope we find our answers, John," she said, her eyes red but dry. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When the door clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed was deeper than ever. With Rachel gone, the house felt both emptier and lighter. I occupied myself with work, finally engaging in projects that had long sat ignored. The routine was comforting, though the evenings stretched longer than I'd ever realized. The absence was loud, a reminder that clarity and answers don't come with the turning of a key or the closing of a door. Weeks passed, and Rachel and I met for counseling still, but now with clearer perspectives. We discussed boundaries, forgiveness, and whether we were still the people who could share a future. The counselor watched us with a practiced neutrality, guiding but not pushing. The decision loomed: rebuild or let go. Kate and I maintained our distant friendship. There was no romance, just understanding. "You need to find out what you really want, John," she said one evening as we walked through the park, fallen leaves crunching under our feet. "And that might not include me or Rachel. Just be honest with yourself." Her words resonated, clear and true. The next counseling session, I told Rachel what I'd realized. "I'm not sure if we're meant to go back to how things were," I said, my voice steady. "But I know we both need to find what makes us whole, even if it's apart." Rachel nodded, a tear escaping despite her calm. "I think you're right." It wasn't an immediate end, but a mutual understanding. We'd walked through fire, exposed every flaw and failing. We agreed to separate, with the potential for a friendship that might grow from the ashes, or at least mutual respect. The pain lingered, but so did a strange kind of peace. One morning, as I stood in the empty kitchen, light streaming through the windows, I felt the weight lift. It wasn't joy, but it was freedom. A beginning, not bound by past mistakes, but shaped by them. And with that, I took a deep breath and stepped into the day, ready to find whatever came next.